So again, good evening, and thank you for being with us today for our second webinar. And today we have with us Professor Kelly O'Neill, and she is going to be with us twice this series. Because and you'll know why after today, but she has some really special kind of data and information to share with you. So I'm going to take a minute to welcome you all and welcome Kelly and introduce her, and then I will turn it over to her to do her presentation. So the topic of tonight's lecture and presentation is plant biodiversity in Ukraine. And our presenter today is Kelly O'Neill. She's a historian of the Russian Empire and an advocate of spatial history. And that's actually, if you've never talked to a spatial historian, and I haven't until I started working at the Davis Center, it's actually really cool. So she'll get to talk to you about that, and you'll see this angle of history that I think for most of us is really rare to see, or not as common as other forms. So her first book, Claiming Crimea, A History of Catherine the Great's Southern Empire, was published by Yale University Press in 2017. And since 2018, she established the Imperia Project at the Davis Center, which integrates history, geographic information science, and historical cartography. She teaches, conducts trainings, workshops, and regularly presents her research to audiences ranging from high school students to colleagues at academic institutions around the world. Kelly holds a PhD in history and a master's in regional studies from Harvard, and the latter is from our VICA program, where she now serves as director of graduate studies. Welcome, Kelly, and welcome everyone who is with us tonight. And with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Sandra. Hello, everyone. I am excited to be here. As I always say in situations like this, no matter how many times you present to your own fellow, historians and colleagues in other fields, when you're talking about teaching with teachers and kind of bringing material into the classroom, I feel like this is when I get nervous. Like I better give you something good because I don't want to disappoint you. This is when it really matters. So I really look forward to the kinds of conversations that we'll have tonight and that you're having with other presenters. I hope to kind of listen in on a lot of the other seminars as well and kind of learn from a lot of the colleagues who are on the list, who are already known to me, and I'm really excited to hear what they have to say about this topic. I think it's great that all of you are here in the room. And I want to start, I know this is a bit of it's not an orthodox beginning to a session like this, but you had the previous session with Nick Brayfogle, and I've known Nick for a really long time, and I'm really interested in the work that he does, and I know his work, but I would really love it if some of you would mind unmuting yourselves and giving me a sense of what your takeaways were from the session with him. What were the things that stuck with you through that session? And I'm asking because I feel like that might be a great way for me to know where your mind is, and what about the material so far is piquing your interest. So would any of you be willing to just share a couple takeaways from the previous session?
Hi, my name is Lindsay Johnston. I'll jump in. The whole topic about the race to the Arctic and looking at how the negotiation and the long-term implications of the law of the seas, with climate change and the melting of the ice, and then what that's causing politically among Russia versus NATO countries, to me was just really, really fascinating. Um, I knew a little bit about it, and in my environmental science class, we do touch on law of the sea. But I typically work in global politics, so when it brought in NATO and Russia and things that I'm a little more comfortable with, I thought, oh, this is all coming together, and
Mm-hmm.
that I really really enjoyed.
Thanks, Lindsay. Anyone else? Could I get maybe one more? viewpoint?
For me, it was kind of interesting because like I'm a sponge. I don't really know anything about this. I kind of just was picking it up in pieces. And like he kind of addressed it from like a timeline perspective, how at one point in history it was in one direction and then now it's totally changed. And the fact that it was controlled as like a national park system that became structured, and then it continued on to gulags and a disappearing system of cotton production. It was like all over the place. So I was trying to figure out like what I really could grasp onto. So it was kind of like so much information that I down the road I'm gonna actually like have to disseminate it myself because there was like I wrote down a whole bunch of scattered notes. So that's what I really
Yeah.
got. I thought it was cool though because like even the hydroelectric that's been established since 1950 successfully, I thought was kind of awesome because we have yet to do that successfully, and it's
Yeah.
2020. So that was a couple of things I had.
Yeah. That's great. So even just from these two comments, I mean, I think these might end up being the kinds of responses that you might have to a lot of these sessions, right? I think when I think about talking about environments, right, and the role of geography and place and environment in particular, as a historian. I think it's really challenging to shape the narrative, to know what is the entry point. What's the exit point? What's the hook? How far deep into the detail do you have to go on things like this in order to be able to make sense of and really be able to talk about implications and connections? And Gunella, I see that you were talking about the RLC and the desiccation of the RLC. Wow, you covered a lot. Wow, okay, that's fantastic. Okay. Um, so I guess in a way, the topic of um, biodiversity and plant biodiversity might seem really boutique and small in comparison. So I don't know if it'll end up feeling that way, but there's the potential, at least as a starting point. And I thought I wanted what I want to do, just so you know, so the game plan is that I want to it seems unfair to talk at you, but you are trapped here for a little bit. I'm going to talk at you just a little bit and kind of give you my spiel on why we're even talking about plants in the first place. And then I want to show you a couple of techniques and some data that I've developed over the years that may or may not be useful. The data itself that I have to offer may or may not be useful, but I'm hoping that it will provide some strategies and kind of analogous scenarios that you might be able to apply in your own teaching and preparation for teaching. So we're going to mess around with some things online and yeah, and just kind of see how that goes. But just as you know, just to kind of get into the talking part, I'm a historian. I'm a historian of the imperial period proper. So when I do most of my work, I focus on the pre-1917 period. And in my own research, I focus on the late 18th, early 19th century. I think that while that might automatically kind of put some real constraints on the kind of history that I teach, it is also true that I teach about empires and I teach about space and I teach about how empires grow and evolve, what makes them work, what makes them fail. And as Sandra was saying, one of the perspectives that I like to take on the story of empire is the spatial perspective, and the environmental perspective. They're not exactly the same thing. But I'm really, really interested in understanding how place shapes daily life at a microscopic level, but also how it shapes kind of the structures of large states. And those are stories that change over time. They change across space. And I really, really like the approach of kind of zeroing in on a particular location and trying to really understand its own dynamics and then think about how you can move from that really highly localized level out to broader and broader levels of analysis and questions and hypotheses. Um, so in a way, I want to show you just a couple of images. Hopefully I'll be able to share my screen. Just to kind of put you in the mindset of plant biodiversity the style of the Russian Empire, which really has its own aesthetic. And I want to just invite you to make the mental connections. They'll probably happen automatically. We're talking about plants, we're talking about particular trees that grew up in Eurasian space, but we can all relate to plants, right? And we can all relate to vegetation and to trees. And I think the question probably lurking in the background of your mind is, why are we talking about plants? What do they have to do with history? But they have everything to do with history. And I'd like to provide kind of a few ways of thinking about the connections between vegetation and particular forms of plants, and how we can tell stories about the past and how we can get students to relate to those stories, whether they are stories that that we might want to tell that are a little bit closer to home, or if our goal is really to get students to relate to places and moments in time that are not familiar to them, right? It's often one of those challenges is to get students to really take seriously the concerns of people who are very far away, however we want to measure that. So that's one of the things I think studying plants and thinking seriously about plants can actually be quite powerful for that reason. So let me show you, see if I'm just going to share my screen. And hopefully continue. Are you able to see an image of a tree? Yes. Okay, great. So this is our moment to kind of clear our minds of, the clutter of the day that you have survived for the most part, and kind of shift your mind into thinking about vegetation and trees and plants and what in the world they have to do with understanding the past. So I want to show you, these are a couple of really classic landscape paintings by very famous 19th century landscape painters from Russia. Ivan Shishkin is one of the most prolific and well-known landscape painters. And so his paintings are collected in the Tretyakov Gallery in Moscow and also in St. Petersburg in the Academy of Arts. And they're kind of all over the place. And when we start thinking about plants and vegetation, in particular trees, in the Eurasian space, and particularly in the Russian space, which is just a subset of the Eurasian space, these are kind of some of the classic images that come to mind, right? You have this, maybe a single lone tree standing in a very monotonous flat space, right? See if I can advance my slide. Another kind of quintessential image of the forest is this thick, dark forest, right? If we're thinking about kind of the northern regions of Eurasia, we're thinking about the pine forest. And we have this sense in this image, if I were to really make you work for it, which I won't do, but you have this guy, you have this kind of peasant of some kind who's in the foreground, and he's staring out at us, and he has this white beard, and he's fine. But as your eye travels into the background, into the darkness, there's a mood to this painting it's a bit somber. It's possibly a little bit unsettling or threatening, depending on how you read the woods. And there's this sense of impenetrability. There's this sense that you enter the forest and you'll be lost. And the forest is so monotonous and continuous and vast that you are sure to be lost. And I mentioned the word vast for a very specific reason. And this is one of the reasons why I think that taking a spatial approach to history can be useful. When we think about a place that's as big as Eurasia, or a place that's as big as the Soviet Union, or a place that's as big as the Russian Empire, or any empire, it's really tempting to apply generalizations, right? We have to. It's not just tempting. We have to do it if we want to describe the space of the Russian Empire. If I were to ask you to do that, you'd probably say things like, well, it's really flat. There are lots of trees, there's a lot of snow, and it's gigantic, right? And those are the kinds of things that generations and generations of professors of Russian history have said on the opening day of their history of Russia, or history of the Soviet Union class. Russia is big, it's really cold, there are a lot of trees, and you kind of leave it at that, right? Sometimes you go on to talk in a little bit more detail about what the implications of those things are, and maybe talk about some of the other landscapes that do exist in this space. But it can be hard to get beyond those big generalizations into a level of nuance and specificity that can be a little bit more useful. So these images of the trees, they actually can get us there. They can start to get us there. Here we see the introduction of the river, right, which is really, really important when we're starting to think about plants and trees. We can't talk about them in isolation from the rest of the natural and man-made environment. The history of trees and plants go hand in hand with the history of water, and particularly of rivers. We're not going to spend the entire time talking about trees, but I do think, I'm actually going to skip over this one. But trees are everywhere in Russian history. I went back to it. I said I would skip it, and then I lied to all of you, and I went back to it. So sorry about that. This is an image of trees in Crimea. There's a Russian officer and a Crimean Tatar on foot. Crimea ended up being quite famous for having wonderful oak trees, and we'll come back to those oak trees in a little bit. And a lot of vegetation, very spectacular vegetation in a landscape that is very, very, very different than the landscape that, that I kind of started out painting, right? This flat, monotonous, cold and dark landscape. There are other parts of the empire that offer alternate visions of vegetation and plant life. There is a lot of diversity, right? Plant diversity in the Russian Empire. In fact, when you start looking at documents of this part of the world, trees and plants are pretty inescapable. They're almost everywhere you look. What you're looking at on this slide is a piece of a 17th century, one of the most famous atlases ever made, actually. This is a map of the Dnipro River, and the Dnieper River in Ukraine. So it's ostensibly a map of a river, but if you're like me, your eye is probably drawn to the vegetation, right? To the trees, to the green spaces here. And this is just one map. I could show you 200, I won't, but trees are a dominant presence as people attempted to describe this part of the world to both domestic audiences and foreign audiences. Trees are part of the story, an important part. The map I just showed you was created by a Dutchman, a Dutch cartographer working in Amsterdam. When Russians began making their own maps of their own space, they started mapping their trees too. This is a series of slides from an agricultural atlas of the Russian Empire. This is just the Eurasian part, the European part of the Russian Empire. And each of the sheets in this atlas shows you the same space, but gives you a different variable. So we see grain production, we see livestock populations, we see all of these core indicators of agricultural productivity. And one of the most important is trees. So it's in the second row, third column, you see tree density. And so this is, something that, as the Russian Empire was kind of evolving and developing a capacity to count and to document and to create relatively sophisticated visualizations of statistics about itself, one of the very first things that it did was make a map of trees, right? This is another version of that, and I like it just because, even if you just rest your eyes on it for a second, you begin to get a sense of how obsessed Russian officials were with trees. You see various levels. The darker the green, the higher the tree count in that region. You see a lot of squiggly lines. I know you can't really get really close to this image, but there are a lot of kind of squiggly lines moving their way across the space. And each one of those represents the line south of which a particular variety of tree does not grow. And the tree varieties are all listed in the upper right of the map. So this is, again, one of these really relatively early attempts by an empire to create a sophisticated visualization of its natural resources, right? And one of the first things that it does is to map its trees. I don't know if any of you have ever tried to map trees, but mapping trees isn't actually all that easy to do. Trees are actually rather difficult to count. And I wanted to bring us back to ground level, away from this very large kind of zoomed out view of all of the Eurasian part of the Russian Empire, and bring us in close to a very particular story that I think is worth telling because of what it reveals about trees. You see on the image here that, actually, I want to tell you one brief little thing, and then we'll get to that story. Sorry. Trees, particular kinds of trees, of course, had very particular functions in empires. So I started out showing you very tall, straight pine trees. And some of you might already know that pine trees have, many uses for construction and for fuel. They were prized in the 17th, 18th, and 19th century because they were wonderful ship masts. And so you have the British officers of the British Navy kind of going out all across Northern Europe and trying to hunt down the best pine trees they could find. And so, as it happens, they found an incredible amount of fantastic pine trees in Russia, right? And British trade with Russia began in the 17th century because of the desire for the British Admiralty to find naval stores. You can see trees here. You can see some really ramshackle kind of peasant huts on the side of the river. And then you'll see that there are a lot of felled timber, a lot of felled trees that are getting lashed together into rafts. And these are trees that have been singled out because they are of good enough quality to be used probably in naval construction, whether in Russia or to be sold to other empires to build their own navies. Which, if anyone wants to talk about the complexity and the irony of selling other empires the goods they need to build the ships that then you'll fight against in particular battles, we can talk about that, but that's something that happens, right? So these timbers would get lashed together. They would sit there, they would get cut down in the fall, they would wait all winter. When the ice would break on the rivers, they would lash the trees together and they would float them downriver from wherever they were felled to the closest place where they could be, the closest admiralty or the closest major port, where they could either be converted into ships or sold. So you get this really, you get this growing sense of the ways trees could be deployed and become incredibly valuable commodities within imperial context. This is something that happens in North America. Of course, probably you might be familiar with the fact that, prior to the American Revolution, the British were harvesting high quality oak trees, right, in the Canadian and American forests. And the way that you do this is you send your officers out and you have them put the mark of the king on an oak tree. And if an oak tree has the mark of a king on it, no one can cut it down other than an officer of the Navy at risk of death. And so the Russians did this too. Peter the Great, who was one of the most famous kind of early czars of the proper Romanov period. So he takes over at the very end of the 17th century and dies in 1725. He founds St. Petersburg and he founds the Russian Navy. And one of the things that he was most famous for in his time among his own people was his decree that anyone who cut down any oak tree in the Russian Empire would be accused of treason and executed. So, this is something that becomes, right, the appetite of the empire for trees becomes something that impacts not just the building of ships themselves and the power of the empire. It impacts the daily life of the people who own the tree, who own the oak trees, who have the land where the oak trees grow. it influences their capacity to operate in terms of agriculture and mobility and all kinds of things. So, yeah, so here's the Admiralty, right? If you don't have an image in your mind of what 19th century St. Petersburg looked like, which not everyone does, here is a view of 19th century St. Petersburg. And on the upper left image, you'll see the Admiralty building is the one with the shiny golden top and the kind of spiky top coming out of it. So you had this scenario where, you have trees growing all over the empire, being felled and sent down rivers. The ones that went north, and most of them ended up in St. Petersburg or in Riga. Most of the major rivers in Russia don't flow northward, they flow southward. And so this also presented some really interesting logistical challenges for the empire, because you had your trees going south, and that actually turned out to be a real boon. In the 18th century, after the time of Peter the Great, he was succeeded by a couple of czars, and then you end up with Catherine the Great. And she is in charge of Russia. You don't have to worry about the dates, of course, right? But she's the Empress of Russia from 1762 to 1796. So basically the entire second half of the 18th century. And she decides that one navy isn't enough, right? She has a navy in the Baltic, but she needs a navy in the Black Sea, and fights a series of wars against the Ottoman Empire and takes over a huge amount of the Black Sea coast, including Crimea. And Crimea is one of those places that I used to have to explain to people. I used to have to tell people prior to 2014, about this little peninsula in the Black Sea that they'd never heard of before. And then Vladimir Putin decided to annex Crimea for the second time in Russia's history. And he solved that problem for me, because now I don't have to tell anyone where Crimea is. But it is this, prominent peninsula sticking out of the northern coast of the Black Sea. And Catherine the Great, who was the first Russian ruler to annex Crimea, decided to establish a navy there. And in order to build a navy, she needed trees, right? And you can see the image on the lower right is an image of Russia's Black Sea fleet as it is flowing through the Bosporus Straits at Istanbul, Constantinople, at the end of the 18th century to go and fight a war against the Ottomans. So this story of empire and the story of trees goes hand in hand. And this is where I think the story really begins and ends. It's not actually a story that really should be told from the perspective of the beautiful Admiralty building in St. Petersburg. And yeah, it's wonderful to kind of look at all these beautiful galley, ships with their furled, their sails and their cannon kind of going off to fight in glorious battles. If you were to ask one of the most senior statesmen of the Russian Empire what the greatest threat to the Russian Empire was in the first half of the 19th century, and this guy has a name. His name is Vorontsov. He was a prince and he was the admiral of the Black Sea Fleet. If you were to ask him that question, he would have said, the biggest threat to the survival of the Russian Empire is goats. And I'm hoping that you're asking yourself the question, why? Why are goats so scary? What is it about goats that make them such a security threat for the entire Romanov regime? And I'm hoping you're asking that question because I'd like to tell you the answer. And I think it's a really fantastic answer. So Vorontsov came from one of the most prestigious families in Russia, in the Russian Empire. And as I said, he was a prince. He was one of the most high-ranking officials on either the civil or the military side of the Russian Empire. He was probably the third or fourth most important guy in the entire Russian Empire in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s. And he was in charge of administering the whole southern part of the Russian Empire. So think Ukraine, think Black Sea coast, think Crimea, this was the whole strategically sensitive area that Vorontsov was in charge of. It was the area of the empire that faced the Ottomans. It was the area of the empire that sat on the Black Sea and was exposed in many ways to invasion, not just by the Ottomans, but by their allies. And their primary allies in the early part of the 19th century were the British and the French. And you probably either teach or have some distant memory of the Crimean War, right? And this is the Crimean War is the war that kind of proves the point that this southern region had global significance in terms of establishing imperial power and maintaining a balance of power in the 19th century. So Vorontsov is in charge of that region, and he had a lot to do. He goes on and he's the conqueror of the Caucasus. I mean, he fought in the Napoleonic Wars. He has an incredible kind of pedigree. His wife had an affair with Alexander Pushkin, who was the most famous poet of all of Russian history. And he was the governor general of this whole area, this called New Russia, Novorossiya, which is also a term that if you are interested in kind of global affairs and geopolitics, you will have heard the term Novorossiya or New Russia, because this is a term that Putin also has used as one of the ways of his framing of the justification of his invasion of Ukraine was to restore Russian control over an area called New Russia or Novorossiya. So that is the area that we're talking about. In 1838, this lovely prince, this well-connected, incredibly powerful guy, decides that he needs a vacation. He needs to step away for a little bit of time, and so he decides to go to his estate in Italy for probably a month. I'm not exactly sure of how long he was away. But the entire time, it really wasn't a great vacation. I don't know if you've ever gone on one of those vacations where you can't turn off your work brain. He was unable to turn off his work brain. And he basically sat there at his villa worrying about what was going on in southern Russia, as it was known then, in Ukraine. And he wrote a letter to one of his close colleagues, to another minister. And he wrote this. He said, "From the moment I took up my position as governor of this region, I have not ceased to seek out the means to protect the forests of Crimea from violation. Those forests, the significance of which is obvious, are located along the coast of the Black Sea and along the edges of the Great Steppe, and in places that are otherwise devoid of forests." And he goes on and on. It's actually the letter that I'm quoting from is 5 pages long, and I'm not going to read the whole thing to you. But he goes on and he explains to his friend that there are two main threats to the vibrancy and sustainability of the Crimean forests, where there are beautiful oak trees that can be used to build the Black Sea Fleet at Sevastopol. He said one of the problems is the ceaseless growth of the region. So what he's actually saying is that there are more and more people settling in this region, and the population growth is a real problem for the Navy, because when people move to a new region, they want to do two things. They want to build homes, and they want to keep themselves warm and cook food. And to do those things, they need timber, right? They need logs. And when they need those things, they go find trees and they cut them down. And when they cut down trees, they're depleting the available resources of the Navy. Because as powerful as the Russian Empire was, it was really terrible at managing control of natural resources. So it's a main threat, and he's complaining. He's writing this letter, and he's talking about the fact that 27,000 acres of trees at a time are getting kind of clear cut, and he says, "I cannot describe to you my astonishment at having seen one of these major valleys completely devoid of trees. Should this be allowed to continue, I assure you, these spectacular forests, which may be counted among the best in the world, will become stretches of empty steppe with no use or value." So that's one of the problems. And then the other problem that he goes on for about 3 pages is goats. He complains to this other minister, Kisilov, he says that there are herds of goats that are at pasture in the alpine meadows. that are next to these oak groves. And the goats had a habit of eating the leaves of the saplings of the young oak trees and destroying for future generations of tree growth. And in so doing, these goats, with their inconvenient appetites, are imperiling the entire existence of the Black Sea fleet because oak trees are so precious and rare, and therefore the security of the empire's entire southern frontier. The remainder of the letter goes on to explain what Vorontsov sees are possible solutions to the problem. He thinks, okay, well, if we've got these precious oak trees and we want to protect them from goats, we could establish guards, right? We can pay people or, just tell them to go and protect the oak trees. We could impose a moratorium on cutting down trees. That might also help. And probably the best thing we could do would be to forcibly remove the entire goat population from Crimea. So this doesn't end up happening, but he tries. When he comes back from vacation, Vorontsov comes back to Crimea and tries to impose a policy basically of deportation of goats from Crimea in order to keep the Black Sea Navy strong. It doesn't work out. We can talk about why if you ever want to. Local landowners and livestock breeders are really not happy about it. So it just doesn't work out. But the idea is, I just kind of love this concept that the entire security of an entire continental empire can hinge on something as highly localized and as high and as close to, the natural world, the world of vegetation and these kind of cyclical organic processes as the young oak sapling, right, that is attempting to grow to maturity in the presence of hungry goats. It's just kind of a wonderful encapsulation of the challenges that are met by 19th century empires. So we can talk about fire if we want to later. I want to kind of step away from the slides for a minute. That is kind of the big chunk of the background and the justification that I'd like to offer. What I haven't done to this point is kind of bring the story forward into the 20th century and the 21st century. We can do that in conversation together, but I wanted to kind of just pause the story here and shift to a different mode of looking at what we know about plants and biodiversity and kind of look at a couple of strategies that mimic what I, in a way, kind of pick up on what I just did, which was to use a very specific bit of archival evidence, right? Use a story, a document, a particular historical detail, and use it to tell a much bigger story, which, every so often is helpful when you're getting students to engage with material that otherwise might not matter too much to them. What I want to do is pivot away from trees a little bit to other forms of plants. I hope no one is going to object too heartily, too much to that, but we'll step away from oak trees a little bit. And the reason for that is I want to just introduce another justification for why you should think about the importance of plants, or why you might want to, when you're thinking about in the environment of Eurasian space and how it works and what drives it and what shapes it, plants have to be part of the conversation. And that is that when we think about plants, we get this wonderful opportunity, again, to connect the local to the global in a different way. Let's pretend that you don't care about empires, right? You're just not interested in history. You're not interested in empires, but you are interested in contemporary issues of climate and natural resource management, maybe the politics or the economics of natural commodities, right? It's possible that you might be interested in such a thing, right? It's important stuff too. So one of the things that's interesting about plants is that they have this tension in them between being highly localized entities and entities that humans have, since the 18th century anyway, tried to fit into global frameworks. So let me say that in a different way. you hit the Age of Enlightenment and you get people in the late 18th and then early 19th century, like Carl Linnaeus and Alexander von Humboldt, who go around either studying the world or actually exploring the world themselves and bringing back huge amounts of scientific data and observations, and then trying to figure out how to fit those observations into, they so are, we're going to get to medicinal in just a second. Yay, I'm so glad you said that. Try to fit all of these plants into a framework so that if someone is off on some exploration of the Altai Mountains, right, out in near Mongolia, and they happen upon a plant and they give it a name, they give the species a name, and they make an exhaustive description of the plant, they can enter it into this system of species and families and all of those kinds of things. And then they publish that. And then when you have another person who is wandering around in the forests of South America and they stumble around upon a plant, there's the possibility that it's the same plant in two different locations, right? And establishing this kind of way, this classification system that you've all studied, I'm sure, at some point in your own education, establishing this classification system using, in the European context, using Latin names for species and plants was one of the strategies for taking what might be exotic and might be really particular and what might be really local and fitting it into a standard kind of system of understanding. And that dynamic, that kind of history of science kind of approach to looking at plants is also potentially really interesting. So I teach history classes, but I also do mapping. I do historical GIS work. I make maps and collect data and try to figure out different ways of taking primary sources that aren't that interesting from other perspectives and kind of mining them for their details about what we might know about the past. So last year, I was working with some graduate students and I said, hey, here's what I want to do. Bear with me. It's a bit of a crazy idea, but I found we were focusing on Ukraine because Ukraine is, occupying a prominent place in, the news cycle at the moment, and it's important. And I found a text that was published at the end of the 19th century by a guy who wanted to become a famous botanist. He was a naturalist, and you can kind of read his eagerness from his pages to be like recognized as one of the great new botanists of the modern age. And he never gets there. Spoiler alert, he's not that famous. His work is not, kitchen table conversation at all, but we have this text that he produced. And what it is the documentation of his firsthand exploration of the region around Odessa, which is one of the largest cities in Ukraine at the very end of the 19th century. And he basically goes around and he itemizes every single plant that he sees. And he tries to identify them. And if they're new and if they're, a discovery, that's really exciting. But it's also really exciting if he can identify them as a known species and plug them into this universal system of knowledge about plant life and biodiversity. And so we took that register, that's really long list of almost 1,000 observation of plants, and we kind of converted it into data and we put it online. And I want to show you one little piece of what we did. And I want to show you the kind of exploration that you can do. I'm going to show you two versions, and then I'm going to ask you to do your own little exploration of this data set, and come back and tell me what you find. So just to recap, what we're looking at is a very narrow source. Like if we're thinking about this as a primary source, all you're looking at is data that's coming from one source. So of course, we don't usually tell our students that they should make any robust claims based on one source, right? We wouldn't want to do that. I want you to be aware you're just looking at one source, but it's one source that tells us a lot about plant diversity in Odessa, in the Odessa region, in the end of the 19th century. Okay, so I want to show you what it looks like. And we will get, within moments, we will get to the medicinal herb point that Krizia, if I'm saying it correctly, made in the chat, which is kind of exciting. Okay. I am going to share my screen. Oh, but I'm also just going to put the link in the chat so that you can explore yourself, because we are all grown-ups here. You don't probably need me to hold your hand, but here we go. Sharing my screen so you can see where I am in the project. So the project is called Odessa in Bloom. Very cutesy, right? Odessa in Ukrainian only has one S. In Russian, it has two. So we put the little parentheses there because the information, the source we were using was produced by, was published in Russian, produced by a Ukrainian who spoke Russian. And Odessa in all of the kind of government-produced documents at the time was known as Odessa with two S's. And place names have a lot of politics attached to them, right? So the project has this background to it, and we're going to just skip right past it. A lot of it kind of gives you, I gave you a sense of what it says. It just describes the source. There's the guy. There is Pyotr Shesterikov. That's the one who never becomes famous, right? He's just not famous. He's a nobody. And sometimes it's the nobodies who really give you the best bits of history, right? He's kind of like charming and handsome. You know, you could have a conversation with this guy, but he's not famous, and he does not change the world of natural science. But he does produce this text. So we created the data and we decided to kind of serve it out in a bunch of different ways. And this is just for fun. I'm going to show you a fun thing and then a slightly more serious thing. One of the things that I had never really spent a lot of time thinking about myself is how funny plant names are. And I don't know if this is something that you have obsessed about, but what you see here is a whole bunch of purple and white on your screen. The darker the purple, the more absurd I think the plant name is. And the lighter the purple, you know, the less absurd it is. And you can read about all the various plant names and find out what I think is so eyebrow raising. This is the eyebrow raising scale analysis of this primary source. So here's a particularly interesting one, the bearded creeper, right? The Barbary matrimony vine, right? There is an incredible amount of creative energy that goes into naming plants in the English language. And I don't think we should let that be forgotten. So we created this little fun game where if you have any interest, right, in plant biodiversity, you can come and play around with plant names. And it actually raises some interesting questions about how these names come to be. But that's not the serious thing that I want to show you. I want to show you the research platform. And I want to show you the kind of plant family portraits. I'm going to start with this because this is quicker, and then we'll do our little exploration exercise. If you click on plant family portraits or just watch me click on it, you'll come to a screen. There's an explanation here, but you will find it's this exact same data, just two different ways. One has the Latin names of plant families and one has the English names. What we did was kind of count up all of the observations of every plant belonging to every family in this source. And so that you could get a sense, and if we just look at the English names, this is just a really quick and dirty way of getting a sense of the biodiversity that you see in this one source. Around this part of Ukraine. And you will see the bigger the dot, the more observations there were. So the most prominent plant families in late 19th century Odessa were sunflowers, which is the national plant of Ukraine, actually. There were a lot of legumes, a lot of bean plants. There were a lot of plants belonging to the mustard family, the mints, parsleys, etc. It's the same data here, it's just Latin names, so it just depends on how you want to go. And one of the things that I like to point out to people is that sometimes it's the dominant family that's the most important, and sometimes it's the teeny tiny ones that are the most important. Rarity, when we're thinking about the world of environment and biodiversity, whether it's animal life or plant life, rarity, scarcity can be just as significant as dominance and abundance. So it's just something to kind of play around with, to kind of get familiar with the contents of the data source. All of the data in the project is published and available if you ever wanted to download it. But I want to bring us right to the main research platform and show you how to play around with it, and then just ask you to do one little exercise. Okay, so this is, as it loads, let me just give it a second. It's thinking, and it's hard for things to think on Zoom. I have to be patient. I'll be patient. Okay, we'll continue to load right here. And I'm just gonna, there's a little link to the full screen version, just because it's easier to see on the screen. So here we're in the full screen version. And I just want to point out one thing that you would learn if you were reading all of the text on the project site. You will learn that, so here's the Odessa region, just so you can kind of see where we are in the world. Here's the Black Sea. And here's the region where all of the observations were made in the 19th century. What you're looking at is not an actual map of where every plant was. That would have been absolutely impossible to establish. The text in the primary source runs like this. I was walking along the edge of a road near a farm and saw a buttercup. Right, that is not a terribly easy thing to go back and map, especially if we're talking about, something that happened a century prior and there's no other details about whose farm, what road it was, what side of the road it was, all of these things. It's absolutely impossible to actually map the locations of the plants. So instead, what we decided to do is say, hey, here's the space of the observations that were made. And then we took up that whole space and we said, if the legumes have lots of observations, they're getting a big chunk. So you can see the legumes right here. There are lots of legume observations. And if they are mallow families, like they get a smaller space. So every family got a chunk of this space that's proportional to the number of observations. The only point here is that this is not the specific location of the plant. It's just an abstraction of the locations. So what you get to do is kind of come in here and say, and this is just background. I can say, okay, I am interested not in cultivated plants, maybe invasive species, but weeds sound great. I love weeds. So show me all the weeds. I'm really interested in weeds, and you'll see that the map has changed. And so now you can only see observations where the plant was described as weed. And then you might say, okay, that's great, but I want particular habitats, right? I want to know if the weeds were growing near another land feature, or maybe they were near in a built area like a town, or maybe near another vegetation feature. So that means like by a garden. So let's say I want to see all the weeds that were growing in the gardens according to this source. So I can click on that. And now you'll see that the number of observations has shrunk way down. And I can say, okay, well, that's great. I'm interested in, well, let's see. Wait a minute, did I get all my weeds? Hang on. Yeah, weeds and vegetation. Ooh, I thought I was gonna get, something else. That's okay. I'm gonna get a couple, here's a poppy, and I'm curious what that is. So I can click on it and I can say, okay, there's my common name, my Latin name. That's all great, but it grows in weedy areas. It's okay, it's abundant, that's good to know, but there's a pretty picture of it. Fantastic. But this is all just information about late 19th century Odessa, and it doesn't really connect to anything, does it? Like, it doesn't connect to the contemporary world. What about, all this is a random bit of information, except that it's not. Set it up well, didn't I? You can click on this little link, and it will bring you to one of the best resources out there for understanding plant biodiversity across the globe. And it will just take a second to load. And it is called the Global Biodiversity International Framework, I think is what the acronym is. And basically what this is a place where scientists around the world input their data about plants. And it's loading really slowly because we're on Zoom. So we'll just give it a second. But if you were able to click a link, a sample link, you'll hopefully see it loading. And what it will do is open up a page that describes everything that is known in this global database about that plant. And it's really taking a long time to load here. I'm gonna come back and see if it's just that plant. I'm gonna click on my flat peas because flat pea sounds great and see if it will load my flat peas. Nope, okay, it's just an issue with Zoom and everything. Hang on, here we come. Okay, let's pretend it's opening up. You're going to see it. I'll talk slowly, so hopefully it will open up. You will get the entry that will describe this particular species of plant, and purportedly everything that's known about it to naturalists, to biologists who study these plants all around the world for as long as people have been collecting information about plants. And if the page would load, which it is not going to load because we're all in this Zoom room together, and this is what technology does when you're doing things. If it were to load, you would see that one of the things that this page gives you is a map that shows you all of the places where this plant has been observed. Ooh, it's finally loading. All of the places, according to this data set, where this plant has been observed. And if there's a yellow dot, that's a place where it's been found. And this is one of those things where, if you were interested in kind of going and figuring out what's the difference between this particular historical source, right, and this global database that's supposedly the place that knows everything there is to know about plant observations, you would say to yourself, well, wait a minute, I was just looking at a map of Ukraine, right? I was just looking at a map of Odessa. And according to this guy, who didn't end up being famous, but he seemed to take his work very seriously, he saw this plant in the Odessa region in the 19th century, but this, authoritative database has no idea that the plant was there. There's no dot there in Ukraine. There's no dot there near Odessa. For one particular plant, that may or may not be a really important finding, right? One of the important takeaways that I think I like to kind of draw out for students is the fact that the information that is immediately available on online resources that are supposedly the best places to find information about the natural world or whatever topic you're looking at, they're not always complete, right? And there are moments where historical documents actually have something to teach us about, you name the subject, but right here we're talking about plant biodiversity. This single flora, this single botanical register, right, that was produced by this guy, Shostakov, in 1898, actually has a lot more information about plant life in Ukraine than this database. It might not end up being, the most important thing for everyone to know about the flat pea, right? I get that. But there are some really interesting questions about information and what is at your fingertips and how you can get at it that are fun to explore. There is another, actually, let me show you one other plant and show you a little rabbit hole that you can go down, which will get us to our medicinal herbs if I do it correctly. I'm gonna look for, I think I meant when I was looking at, I clicked on the wrong thing before. I'm gonna look at my weeds and I'm gonna look at my gardens, and I think that's gonna take me. It's really funny how things don't work when you're in front of people. Actually, just reset this. If you're interested in, aquatic plants or invasive species, of course, you can play around with things like that. But I wanted to show you one that does end up having a very interesting history. And now I have forgotten how to find it because I clicked on the wrong thing. Okay, you can trust me that it's in there. It is, I'll just bring up the Wikipedia page. We'll skip through the clicking and I will show you the purslane plant, which I do like plants, but I know almost nothing about them. So I did not know anything about this, but you might know yourself if you are a plant addict. And this is the plant that whose dot I would have been clicking on if I were not in front of all of you with utter stage fright, obviously. This is one of the plants that shows up being incredibly widespread across the entire region, not specific to Ukraine at all. A very, very common plant. And you can, of course, read about the plant on the Global Biodiversity website, or you can have a student or yourself go right to Wikipedia and see what you can find out. And what you find out about this plant, if you kind of just go down to the bottom, is that it's not just any plant, it's actually an edible plant. And it is used, you can find all kinds of cultural information about its use in dishes in Greek cooking and Turkish cooking throughout the Middle East and Asia. And it turns out to be a very, very highly nutritious plant with a lot of antioxidant qualities. And there's a whole lot of scientific research, both around its nutrition and its cultural value, well beyond the space of Ukraine. Which is one of the ways, one of just kind of an example of how you go from a historical source that is incredibly, boutique and narrow and small in its focus, right? This is just a list of plants that grew up in 1898 in Ukraine. And if you follow the history of the plant and follow the documentation of the plant through these kind of more global and easy to access kind of resources, you start unpacking stories about the connection between the plant and the culture, the plant and the politics, the plant, the empire, the plant and science, and any number of really interesting questions. So I'm going to ask you, I have one other thing that I want to show you, which is another kind of entry point into thinking about plant biodiversity. But I want to ask you just for kicks to spend a moment kind of clicking around and using these little indicators. Growth type is pretty self-explanatory. Prevalence is pretty self-explanatory. You might be interested in abundant plants or rare plants, or all of the language here is taken from the source. So it's supposed to be a reflection of how Shostakov saw the world. Geological formations means, if you're interested in plants that grow on mountains or near rocks, that would be your category. If you're interested in water features, things that grow in or near rivers or marshes or the sea itself, a relief feature would be a mountain or a cliff. If you want something where Shostakov tells you about the soil quality of the plant, you can click on that. So I'm just going to ask you to click around and find, or if you don't want to use the filters, you don't have to. You can just click on something that sounds interesting to you. If you zoom in on the map, you'll see what kind of habitat type the plant grew in. So if you're really interested in what is a plant that grows in a wasteland, you can click on that and get your bit of information. And there's always a picture of the family that it comes from. And there's that link to the outside source. You don't have to use that link. But what I'd love you to take a couple minutes doing is click on something, follow that plant somewhere to a story that is broader, right? To a story that connects to something bigger, or simply something that you feel is significant about a story you could tell in a classroom. So let me just give you a couple minutes to click around, and then I'll ask some of you to share what you find. And then I'll show you one last thing.
Kelly, in the meantime, we have a couple of comments in the chat to take a look at.
Perfect.
Do you want me to read them for you?
No, I can look at them right now. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Oh, you cook it, Gunell. You use the purslane. That's fantastic. Okay, so you're going to have to unmute yourself at some point and tell us all about it. And then Cruzio is asking about Kazakhstan. So yes, absolutely. Not in this data set, but similar kinds of sources were produced by botanists and budding naturalists throughout Central Asia, throughout the Caucasus, in Ukraine. You get actually pretty decent coverage for the borderland parts of the Russian Empire. Not always produced at the same time. The publication dates do differ. And I don't know off the top of my head what volumes I could point you toward for Kazakhstan, but I'd be happy to follow up with some examples from Kazakhstan. Yeah.
While
And I'm
we're
going to give you
waiting,
about 5 minutes. Go ahead. Oh, sorry, Sandra.
no, I just wanted to ask you a question, and I
Yeah.
don't know, maybe somebody else may have the same question, but this particular source that you use the data set and, well, actually the source from which you extracted the data set and mapped it, is it available in translation or only in original language, in Russian?
It is only available in Russian, but all of the data that we pulled from it, so all of the plant names and family names and, you know, what you see here, notes about the habitat, notes about the precise location where it was found, we did translate all of that is available in English. So the data set that we produced is all in English, but the original source itself is in Russian. So if you wanted to kind of look at, you know, Shosterikov's own little bits of text that, yeah, that we can't do. But the data is in English.
Oh, Krizia is asking for, Krizia, are you asking for the website link?
Oh,
Because it's right up or directly to
I
the.
can drop the one directly to the map right here in the chat. Sorry about that. Hang on.
Okay,
There you go.
thank you.
And if you want the other, you know, that other map on the side, to the context map to go away, you can just drag that bar across the screen and then you have a bigger space to explore. There are all these little tricks. Yeah, Bill was just pointing out that you can adjust the discovery date ranges on the Global Biodiversity Index site. So yeah, I mean, you can see that there, I'll open up an example of that their data is historical, right? It's not just the last 20 years or something. They've digitized, people have digitized, and they've ingested information, you know, back into, I think as early as the 1830s, could be even earlier. But what's interesting is that it's not all the documents, right? It's not all of the data. I mean, no one has all the data. It's completely unfair of me to criticize them. I understand that. But I just wanted, so here's common duckweed, right? Ooh, see, place names are fantastic in English, or plant names. Common duckweed, that's great. Not many observations of the duckweed. Seems a bit rare. But you have this time slider down here at the bottom. So let's just say that there were tons of observations. By using the time slider here, you can see, you know, when they were produced, which is also, you know, yeah, it's about, oh, there we go. Now we've loaded. Sorry, I was going to say common duckweed's not that rare. You know, it's interesting too, because it's essentially a view into the history of the natural world, right? Like, when was this information actually collected? When was it published? You know, what did people know about the world up to 1750 about common duckweed? Well, they know those three things, right? In 1750, those three things have been published, right? By people in the world of naturalism. So, you know, the time slider gives you a nice little window into the history of data about the natural world, which is kind of cool. All right, so is anyone feeling brave enough to share a curiosity or a finding from the data? any little rabbit holes that you decided to go down.
I actually found something interesting on the earth chestnut, whatever that is. In China in 2006, it was actually discovered. I'm trying to figure out what happened in 2006 that actually made this like discovery into China. So historically, I'm wondering.
Mm. Mm-hmm. Right. And so this is one of those little nuggets, right? These little nuggets are everywhere about, didn't we already know in 2006 everything we could possibly know about plant biodiversity? No, maybe we didn't. You know, why are things being discovered? In what context? Are they actually being discovered? Or are these things that, you know, local inhabitants knew there were earth chestnuts here always, right? But now scientists have discovered this, right? There are all kinds of fun questions to add about kind of the politics and the culture of scientific knowledge about the natural world. Yeah, thanks, Bill. Anyone else?
I want to share. It's funny looking at these plants, how they're native in one country, but then invasive in another. And then when you're trying to figure them out, it's like, well, who kind of considers them invasive? Considering if they're growing, that means that the the what's that what's the wording I'm looking for? That the conditions were right for that plant to grow in the first place.
Oh, yeah.
So that means it's like technically, wouldn't it have not been invasive?
Which raises all kinds of interesting things to explore, right? About the concept of nativeness, the concept of invasiveness. It also raises questions about, okay, whether it's native or you know, invasive, if it hadn't been observed in that place before, why has it appeared, right? Why did that earth chestnut show up suddenly in China in 2006 in whatever specific location it showed up in? You know, why did whatever invasive plant show up in, you know, 1898 around the city of Odessa? And I'm guessing there's no way you could establish for that particular plant, that particular observation, what happened. But if you ask that kind of question with your students, you're going to start asking questions about historical context, right? And who's moving around in this region at that time, right? What is the nature of economic exchange going on in late 19th century Black Sea, right? Which ships are coming in? Is it possible that they are importing or exporting some sort of agricultural product or plant? Is it possible that the ship itself has a form of bacteria or a bit of a plant, you know, embedded in the hull that somehow gets blown off, you know, onto the surrounding area, and then you get an invasive species? You know, we all know how these things can happen, but once you make that initial observation of an outlying bit of data, right? Sometimes it's the big trends, but sometimes it's those little nuances, right? And you start digging and asking the why questions and the how questions. All of a sudden, you go from a little observation of a buttercup to understanding something about, you know, international shipping, right? In the 1890s across the Russian and Ottoman empires, right? And that's where the real fun comes in. And that's the, you know, the point of this project. I don't expect anyone to care about any one of these particular plants. I'm thrilled if they do. But the real point of the project is to kind of get at some of these bigger questions about how we know what we know and how we can connect bits of historical information to these really big, important questions. And when I say big, I don't mean just like empires. I mean like, how do people survive? What food did they cook? You know, how do they make their way through daily life, right? There's all of that. Does anyone else want to share anything?
Yeah, when you were demonstrating it, I actually wanted to look at the invasive species, but then it doesn't say, it says invasive wild, but not invasive cultivated. And so that's because living in the Sonoran Desert, we have like the Africanization of the Sonoran Desert has been an issue where people brought plants from South Africa, planted them in Arizona, and then they've kind of taken over. And so I was, but when I was looking at it, I was like fascinated that this invasive species, it was what was it? It was Melalotus dentatus. And it was like spread all across northern Eurasia. And then there was one dot in the Azores and then one in like Pennsylvania. So I was like, that's it, it's somebody must have like brought it with them.
Yeah.
So,
Yep. And I love, sometimes you get those little, when it's one in Pennsylvania, if you read the data, sometimes you'll get really full information, and it's in like, it's a dried specimen in a museum, right? Not even something occurring in the, yeah, but, which is also interesting. So yeah, you get this, yeah, I mean, these stories that are, you know, they're hard to get to the bottom of, right? And there's a little bit of that sense of dissatisfaction that you can't know exactly why in every case. But I think that tends to be a pretty healthy thing to like, you know, question our sense of what can be known and what can't be known about the past. I just want to show you one other resource if you are interested in plant biodiversity. It's a resource, again, that contains information about the Eurasian region, but has global coverage. So kind of no matter what you end up wanting to get into. If you haven't already, and I hadn't before I started working on this project, let me, sorry, share my screen again. I would like to be the one to introduce you to the Biodiversity Heritage Library. And if you haven't known about its existence, you are just like me. There is, this is an incredible collaborative project hosted by Smithsonian. There is actually, so my Zoom screen is covering up part of my, somewhere on here, there's a note that explains that the future of the library is not necessarily, it's a little bit in jeopardy because of federal funding issues. So as long as it's here, I recommend that you make use of it. It's a collection of texts that have been digitized by university libraries and archives all over the globe. They're available in all different languages, and you can search it and you can access them right here. It's absolutely amazing. And I thought that I would just, you can plug in whatever search term you want. Just because I told you a story about Crimean goats, I'm going to plug Crimea into the search and show you what comes up. And again, the point of this is to show you, like, you know, we're interested in plant biodiversity, and this is the Biodiversity Heritage Library. So if you scroll through a little bit further, we'll come back to the top of the list, but, you know, there are a lot of entries like this with a lot of Latin words that I struggle. I don't know how to pronounce correctly. I was actually really curious. I saw notes on some Myxomycetes from Crimea. I'm sorry, I don't know. That was a tough word for me because I had never heard of those and I didn't know what they were. And it turns out they're a form of like a fungi, like basically a mold. It's basically a mold. So there's information about a mold. And that seems normal, right? If you're looking at a biodiversity library, you expect to see things about cave spiders and mold and plant species. But if you notice at the top of the list, the very first entry when you plug in Crimea is a book published by an Englishman in 1881 about sport in Crimea and the Caucasus. Might not be what you expect to find in a source on biodiversity, but again, it's one of those things, if you start kind of digging in and thinking about it, it's incredible the kinds of connections that you get at when you start with a plant. Again, this will take forever to load because we're in Zoom, but if you are doing the same thing on your computer, you will be a little bit ahead of me, and you will see that you now have this one lovely man's account of his hunting expedition in the Crimea and the Caucasus in the late 19th century. And if you think about it for a moment, hunters actually pay quite a lot of attention to biodiversity, to the presence of animals and the presence of plants and vegetation that feed animals. And so it ends up, it's quite an unexpected source. I'm gonna just scroll down. There's obviously a table of contents. I'm just gonna scroll down to page 14. This might be page 14. My computer's working really slowly. But just to kind of give you a sense of, oh, that's not 14. We'll go a little bit further. If you aren't familiar with hunting publications, this actually was a big genre in the late 19th century. The age of exploration in mountains, alpine regions, mountaineering hunting, big game hunting became really, really popular. And it was especially the British and the Americans that published these kinds of accounts. And people would just gobble them up. And you get here on page 14, you get these, he talks about tobacco, and then he talks about, the wild wastelands and the stillness. And I might have chosen the wrong page, but on the next page, I'm not going to keep scrolling. He has these really, really detailed descriptions of all of the birds, all of the fowl that you'd find throughout the Crimea and the Caucasus. And it might not be the first place you would have thought to have looked to find out something about what animals and plants existed at this time and in this place. But this hunter has actually produced one of the most accessible and relatable sources for understanding the natural world. And it's right here at your fingertips in the biodiversity library. And the beauty of this is that it's not, inaccessible data. This is someone's story, right? And you get to read stories about, the animals that he shoots and what they find and all of his adventures, right? And this is a kind of like juicy and fun qualitative source that can make the story of the Eurasian environment kind of come to life. This is one example, and I can't remember if it may have been Crizio was asking, is there something for Kazakhstan, right? This is Ukraine. Yes, there's a lot for Central Asia. And in fact, there is a huge, huge kind of travel industry in the Caucasus and Central Asia in the early 19th and, the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And there are just tons of travel accounts that describe the natural world of Eurasia, particularly of those areas at the time. So there's a lot of really cool entry points into understanding biodiversity in the natural world, even in the historical period. Whether or not they're all relevant or appealing for all of you in the work that you're doing and the teaching that you're doing, who knows, but there's a lot there at your fingertips. And I just wanted to share that kind of sense that, even in something really, really small, and something really, really kind of boutique and nuanced, there are huge, huge stories to tell, and there are huge questions that you can get your students to ask about what we know about past and how we can connect the past to the present. So that was what I wanted to share with you. Thank you for taking some of that in and being here.